Our Middle East correspondent Yola Abdafid reporting. Yola joins me now in the studio. Also with us is James Dorsey. He is a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. James, we'll come to you in just a moment. Let's start with you, Yola, though. The Middle East rarely has a quiet year. In 2017, as you did this review, did something particularly stand out for you?
Well, I mentioned the GCC and Qatar, but the war in Yemen, you know, the figures are astounding. 60% of the people in Yemen who live there are short of food. Almost 7 million people face those food shortages daily, 3.1 million children. It is incredible how many people are internally displaced. And yet this is a war that basically we don't see that much of on our television screens because it's too difficult or too dangerous to report there. Yemen is a huge factor, again, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Lebanon, we saw the resignation. Hariri went to Saudi Arabia, then he left, then he rescinded his resignation. Again, it's that power play between between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And then, you know, we've spoken about Daesh and the battle against them in Iraq and in Syria, and the way that Shah al-Shabi has been used as the Iranian-backed militia so successfully in Iraq and Syria to clear Daesh from most areas. And then there's Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, in a way, has refocused again most of the Arab world in terms of Israel, American policy, or what is the American policy in the Middle East, and, of course, this unity in support of Palestine.
James Dorsey, can you do the same as Yolo and sum up the year in the Middle East in 1 minute from your perspective?
Sure. I basically agree with your correspondent. I think the three overarching themes that I would look at is, one, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry with its fallout across the Middle East in Yemen, Lebanon, and elsewhere, the rise of Donald Trump, and the greater assertiveness of the United Arab Emirates.
Interesting you mentioned Donald Trump there. Does he say one thing in public and another thing in private? He has spoken out against Qatar, and then he was there and sold them some weapons. He's made this announcement about Jerusalem. He's received a certain amount of support from particularly Saudi Arabia. Let's call that support this particular silence from Riyadh on the Jerusalem issue. How is Donald Trump affecting the Middle East? Just expand on that issue.
I think as a matter of principle, one has to look at what Donald Trump says, and particularly his tweets, on a case-by-case basis. You often have a situation in which he tweets one thing, the U.S. administration as a total does something else. What I think the significance of Donald Trump is the fact that he has given the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Israelis a degree of reassurance of what his priorities are and how they align with those of the three U.S. allies in the region in ways that the previous administration of Barack Obama didn't. And that, in a world in which the Saudis, the Emiratis, and to a degree also the Israelis feel that they have to be more assertive and cannot exclusively rely passively on U.S. support, that has emboldened them.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, of course, he says that others outside the Muslim world are trying to divide us and turn us against each other. Some people might say that the Muslim world does that quite well on its own.
I would agree with the second. I think you have a situation in which, for the United States, for the Israelis, for the Emiratis, and for the Saudis, the primary issue is Iran. And if that means a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that does not meet minimal Palestinian demands, so be it.
Yola, does the Middle East have the leaders it needs to sort out these problems? That is a huge question, of course.
Well, you could ask the same question in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe as well, couldn't you? In terms of the American Middle East policy, we haven't seen one yet. We're told there could be this new deal in terms of the ultimate deal, as Donald Trump calls it, in terms of Palestine and Israel early in the new year. But it doesn't look particularly hopeful, especially from the perspective of the Middle East. If Trump makes this unilateral decision in terms of Jerusalem, and then, of course, the reaction from the OIC was to recognize East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinians, you can see that huge division already. Palestinians are actually telling me when I was there in Jerusalem the other day, they were saying, look, we're not that concerned what the leaders are saying because they're concerned about corruption and lack of free and fair elections. They're more worried about their everyday lives. And that is also true in what I've seen in Lebanon, what I've seen in Iraq. People are happy that Daesh were moved away from certain territories in Syria and Daesh. But what follows that as a political leadership? That's what concerns people.
James Dorsey, just in 30 seconds finally, how important is it that the Gulf crisis, the blockade of Qatar, that disagreement gets resolved quickly?
As a matter of principle, it's very important. As a matter of reality, it likely is not. I think you have a situation in which there are only two solutions. One is one of the two sides caves in, which is highly unlikely, or the Saudis and the Emiratis are willing to engage in some sort of face-saving formula that would allow them to put the conflict behind them.
Okay, Yolo, let's look ahead to 2018. What do you foresee?
Well, that face-saving point made by James Dorsey is important because that does play a part in terms of the Arab world. Big presidential elections in Egypt coming up in 2018. There's an Iraqi general election, including supposedly an election in the KRG region in the north. There's a Lebanese parliamentary election. All these are very, very important, again, given the context of Saudi Arabia and Iran. And we would expect this Middle East policy from Donald Trump. There are midterm elections in America, which may impact Donald Trump, and there's a Russian election as well. Now, nobody really thinks that Putin's not going to win, but Putin's influence and Russia's influence, like Iran, is increasing.
Yolo, thank you very much. And James Dorsey, really appreciate you joining us from Singapore. Thank you for your time, both of you.